Welcome to session 5 on international joint ventures, and in this session, in this pre-video, we're going to look at what an international joint venture is, and in particular I'd like you to understand why the international aspect of it makes these particular joint ventures different from an ordinary joint venture. In relation to that, it's useful for you to have in mind that within any joint venture we're trying to develop a relationship between the two parties. Perhaps in international joint ventures we're also trying to develop some understanding wider than the company itself that we're wanting to engage with. We want to develop an understanding of the context and the practice of business in that particular country. So let's remind ourselves generally of strategic alliances and how relationships are built. You may want to pause here for a second and review what we did in session 2 on strategic alliances. In terms of this figure, we have level of interaction, which we can perhaps equate to the cost of management. How much time is going to be needed in order to manage this strategic alliance and eventually joint venture? And along the horizontal axis, level of cooperation can be equated to issues of control and the problems that may entail, and we'll be looking at this in pre-video for later on. Okay, so the first step often involves some kind of partnership agreement, and you will recall that we have the Uppsala model, which helps us to understand how that initial interaction, initial relationship starts. Based on that experience, the relationship may move on to some kind of licensing where the level of cooperation has increased, but effectively the management there's some engagement, but it's basically left for the foreign partner to implement business through that licensing agreement. We can move on further towards franchising. And as just stated, you may want to just remind yourself of the differences between licensing and franchising. Where we start getting a much stronger relationship is where there is some kind of research and development agreement. And in order to have a research and development agreement, implied within that is there will be some kind of joint ownership of any IPR that might arise, any intellectual property rights. Moving on from that, the next stage may be a production agreement where, as implied in the R&D agreement, there has to be some kind of finances put into building a factory or building the processes for there to be a production. So we're getting issues of some kind of ownership, or specifically joint ownership, and we're getting financial agreements as part of this as well. And then finally that can lead to a joint venture. And in some respects a joint venture is, if we like, take an analogy, is the idea that if we have two hearts that we start off with initially, then eventually we get the idea of two hearts beating as one. However, what does it mean for two hearts to beat as one? And an alternative way of looking at it is that we start off with two individual companies, and together they become a we. But in terms of becoming a we, the individuals still remain as they are, And the question is, what does we look like? So let's have a look at that. What does a joint venture? How might we view it? So a joint venture, and I'd like to just pause and just read this initial definition. We can see that in terms of a joint venture, there's some kind of common project. We're going to do something together. Who are we? Well, we are legally and commercially independent. So we do things together, but when we do things jointly, then both of us have to bear the risk for, or the responsibility for, management and financial risk. An example of this is the iconic brand Hovis in the UK, owned by Premier Foods, who has done a joint venture with a US private equity business. And you can read this for yourself and follow up in relation to this link at the bottom. At this stage, I'd just like to highlight one or two things after you've done that. Firstly, if it's reinforcing the fact that the companies are jointly investing 45 million in cash. And it's going to be a program or a project which is going to last for 5 years. So the idea is there is a limit to the joint venture. It's not something that's open-ended. So let's have another look at what a joint venture might look like. Again, just pause to read this definition. And again, we have this idea of economically separate organisational entities, but we have the introduction of this idea of parent organisations. And this is useful to remember that in many organisations, they're not single businesses, they're multi-business firms, and in multi-business firms, there tends to be some kind of headquarters or corporate centre, and that corporate centre is dealing with a whole number of subsidiaries. And what we have here is one of the subsidiaries will be linking with potentially a subsidiary of another corporation. So there is a slight separation. There's the headquarters and then there's the subsidiaries. And what are they doing? Well, it's not just management and financial. The financial is always underpinning a joint venture. And it's not just management, but it's also other resources. And those other resources used to pursue certain objectives. So we set out at the beginning what we want to achieve. So if we pause there a minute, and if you want to read this mini case study of medical marijuana and Marijuana Incorporated. And you can see that within this mini case study, the companies talk about development and distribution. They talk about having agreed to research, develop and distribute. So there's issues of R&D, there's issue of product development, but also of the business side of things in terms of getting the product physically to market. And further, they're looking to expand a retail distribution in terms of other products as well. So at this stage, I'd like to just pause and just think about the characteristics of international joint ventures. So let's have a look at some of the characteristics. you may well have got a number of these. Firstly, there's an equity stake. There has to be some kind of financial a financial agreement. It in that very that vernacular way, or the idiomatic way of saying, put your money where your mouth is. If someone's going to have a joint venture and they're going to share in the outcomes of the joint venture, then they also have to put in an equity stake at the beginning. There should be reciprocity, and in particular, balanced reciprocity. So whatever one partner brings in should be balanced by what the other does. There has to be a sense that both are bringing resources, capabilities, or whatever it may be, into the relationship. Now, compare that with negative reciprocity, which when you have rather than having balanced, what we end up with is a situation where something like this, where one party puts in very little but gains from the other. So this is a negative reciprocity, and one can see what that might mean for the relationship. One of the characteristics that's come out is that things have to be well defined, often in relation to timescales. How long are we going to be together for? What are we intending to do? And what we intend to do is often quite limited strategic objectives. And as in the first definition, often these can be perceived as almost project-based activities. Let's have a look at a few more characteristics. So most international joint ventures have an instability related to them, and that instability often arises because in an IJV there has to be some kind of sharing of control, and this is, if you like, a behavioural aspect of reciprocity. If it's joint, two parties come together, each putting in something that the other values, then as the project of the international joint venture starts unfolding, who's going to control that? And there has to be an element of sharing control. But often that has to be learned, because companies are used to making decisions in a very much a one-dimensional way, top-down, however you want to put it. In an international joint venture, there has to be an aspect of sharing control. And as we'll see, this can be fraught with communication issues and others, which can come under the banner of culture or cultural differences. And finally, IJV is time consuming. One does need to have management involved. As recall from the graph on page 2, as we go through an initial agreement, partnership agreement, through licensing, franchising, R&D and so on, the level of interaction, the level of cooperation increases, and the cost to management in terms of management time also increases. Okay, that's the end of video 1, and the next video we'll look at why companies choose to enter